here's Brodie Brazil.
I'll be honest, of all the videos I make here on this channel, this one you're watching right now, it should end up as one of the most popular and also should be one of the most important. I'm going to try and spell out here how to make better and safer landings in 6 steps. These are things I want you to think about as you practice your landings, as you continue to make landings across your flying career. Safer is actually more important than better, but usually safer and better go hand in hand. There's a smoothness, there's an accuracy. I think it's all about the replication of better and safe landings. It's one thing to be mostly safe and mostly making good landings. You're really striving for consistency so that every time it's a safe landing, but there are also a lot of good landings along the way. So let's get into my 6 steps here. Number 1, a stabilized approach. That's something the FAA has been telling you for a long time. It's part of all your training. You are aiming for a stabilized approach every single time. If you don't have that, end the approach. Abort it, go around, have another try at it. There's no shame in that. It's my last point here, but go-arounds are good. You've recognized I can't get this down in a safe manner. I'm going to have to do something too extreme to put it in a good landing position. I don't want to do that. But I'm also here to say that a steep approach or a shallow approach, generally speaking, are okay. Stabilized to me means that there's no large corrections. You're not all of a sudden super high, then you got to dump down to get down here, and now you're kind of low and slow. There's a lot of large-scale corrections that would make an unstabilized approach. But generally speaking, so long as you've got kind of a trajectory and a trend of the airplane, and that trend is going to put you in a right spot at the very end, that's fine. That is considered a stabilized approach. It can be steep, it can be shallow to certain extents, but no large corrections. And for me, a stabilized approach, it doesn't just begin on the final leg. To me, if you're flying the pattern, it begins on a base leg, or if you're in a long final situation, it honestly begins like 10 to 15 miles out. A lot of people think that the stabilized approach is the final mile or two. And while, yes, those corrections might matter even more than farther away, let's not sleep on the fact that the base leg is super important, your continued descent, how far away you are from the runway environment, or even your long final, how you're setting up for this ultimate short approach here. So a stabilized approach is the ultimate number 1. There's no question about it. And if you don't have it, again, there's no shame. You can always go around. It is much more preferable in the long run. Okay, number 2 out of 6 steps here, it's all about energy management. You think about this. You're trading in your descent altitude and airspeed constantly. And these trades, they need to happen in harmony. For example, if you're high but you're slow, okay, well, maybe you can point the nose down and come down a little bit quicker, trade some of that altitude for airspeed that you know you can take on. Conversely, if you're low and fast, well, maybe hold the nose off a little bit, level out for just a second, get that airspeed, that tape or that needle to come down a little bit, get into an airspeed window that is favorable for your final approach. Again, it's all about that trade-off, altitude versus airspeed, because usually when you're going for one, you might have to sacrifice the other. They do work in harmony. So know the tools, know what is available at your disposal. You know, you're high and fast, right? High and hot. You hear that one a lot. What can you do? Can you chop the power even more than you normally would? Can you do some S-turns? Can you do a forward slip? Are you far enough away and the traffic would allow that you can just do a right or left 360 in the current position if that is the safe thing to do far enough out on your approach, right? So there are things at your disposal, but it's all about energy management. Did I mention flap settings? Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do to alter this, but just know that altitude and airspeed are the 2 main things that you're trading off here in terms of performance and ultimately the best and safe landing. Okay, the descent, the round out, and the flare. As we get into our short final here, those are 3 distinct phases, and they need to happen in that order. Because too often, when teaching students, I saw this. A descent that would ultimately kind of level out, then some more descent, and then maybe a round out, but holding it off too long, and then maybe nose down, and I've given up on it. Like, you cannot do that. This has to be very deliberate. going from the descent to the round out to the flare. The descent is the aircraft still coming down, right? Easy. The round out is when now we're getting into ground effect. We're a couple feet off the runway, and we're just going to kind of level it off here, hold a little bit of nose up, continue that slowing. At this point, the power is hopefully at idle enough to let that airplane just sink its final few feet. And yeah, we're trying for a sink rate at the very end of the smallest amount, right? That smallest amount of sink rate is going to give you the smoothest landing to paint those wheels on the runway. And then the flare, where you're just holding it off. The flare and the round out, and I again, they're two different things. I understand how they could be meshed into one, but the round out is leveling it off. The flare is then holding it, keeping the nose up, adding a little bit more back pressure as you get slower until you've touched down, and then ultimately letting the airplane land itself. You've heard that before, but that is so critical. If you hold it in that spot, which we'll get to more on this in a second, if you hold it in that spot, literally the airplane will, land itself. Point number 4 here. It's almost like I planned it this way. A forced landing or a rushed landing, generally almost always bad. How many times have you seen somebody force it on or rush the landing and, that was a good landing? No. Generally, that's when there's a lack of crosswind inputs, or we bounce, or we float, or something's wrong. And there is that tendency among newer pilots, whether you're a private and you're recently licensed or you're a student pilot, that you don't spend a ton of time landing the airplane, and this is the part that kind of gets your heart pumping. So you force it, you rush it, you try and get that plane on the ground so that you can accomplish the task. Don't force it. Don't rush it. Patience is key. I know you're looking at runway distance remaining, but generally speaking, if you hit that target, you're aiming for the touchdown zone or you're aiming for the numbers and you have a plenty long enough runway landing surface, use that patience. So long as the end of the runway is not coming up, use that patience. And then I say let the airplane sit. Like literally just kind of let it sit in that landing attitude. Couple degrees, nose up, whatever it is, just let it sit right there, let it sit. It'll keep sinking and then it'll touch down on the main wheels first. Think about a tricycle gear airplane. How many landing wheels do you have on it? Now, this is a great question. Ask this to your pilot friends. How many landing wheels are on a tricycle gear aircraft? 2. You have 2 landing wheels. Your nose gear is not a landing wheel. We'll call it a steering wheel. We call it a lot of things, but you want to put all the landing weight on your main gears. That's where the shock absorption is built in. Just look at the nose gear, how it's constructed. It is not meant to take the brunt of a landing. My goodness. That's how you bend a firewall. 2 landing wheels, put those, by keeping the nose up, by keeping it in this kind of like sitting position right here, you're putting the main wheels down first, let the nose gear come down, but you're also holding off the nose, you're bleeding off that airspeed, you're getting to the smoothest and the safest landing. Let the plane land itself. If you hold it right there, it'll land when it's ready. Okay, number 5 out of 6 here. Airspeeds matter so much. And that relates to being a couple knots slow or fast, or what the wind velocity is doing to your airplane across the ground. Knots for me translate into runway distance. If you're 5 knots fast, or you've got a 4-knot tailwind pushing you down, that's going to extend greatly the amount of runway you use. And if you're trying to put a single engine piston down on any regular basis on a 2,500 foot strip that's maybe, 30 feet wide, okay, like now we're talking here, though. Every foot matters here. Every 100 of feet especially matters. And so every knot of wind and every knot of performance actually matters to you here. The common things that I see with mismanaged airspeeds as it relates to landings are floating, obviously, holding it, and you're doing fine. You're holding the nose off. You're letting the airplane land itself. But because of that, if you're 5 knots fast, you're carrying a lot of that float for a very long period of time, and you're wasting all of that runway. So floating and dropping. Dropping is the other one, the reverse side of it. You're too slow, you run out of airspeed, stall horn comes on, it's beep, and then it gets really intense, and then you drop out of the sky. You drop those final 5 feet instead of descending those final 5 feet. So floating and dropping, it gets obviously more dangerous than that. if you're out of airspeed on short final or in your base to final turn, you could stall the airplane and crash it just short of the runway. So airspeeds matter. I know this is number 5 out of 6. This could easily be number 1 or number 2. Without airspeed, you do not have a stabilized approach. And then last but certainly not least here, utilize an outside mental picture to make the best and safest landings. There's that landing attitude, which I've been talking about. It's kind of that sitting position, right? Holding the nose off, letting the main wheels touch down first. But it's hard sometimes while you're in the airplane, while you're at the controls, one hand on the control wheel, and the other hand on the throttle quadrant or the throttle itself, or vice versa if you're on the right side. But the landing attitude might be hard to see from the inside of the airplane. Sometimes that takes months and years and even decades to really master and to know your airplane, how high it sits, and that perspective of watching, the runway kind of come up in your view out your windshield. That landing attitude might be hard to gauge from inside the airplane. So take yourself outside the plane for just a second. Know what the plane looks like, descending still in the plane. Know what it looks like at a rounded out attitude, and then know what it looks like with that slightly nose up attitude. Know what that looks like inside the plane so that you can get this outside mental picture. I've told a lot of students this over time when they struggled with landings. You only know it from your perspective inside the airplane. Go to the patio or the perch or wherever it is at your local airport when you're learning how to land and watch a bunch of other airplanes make landings. Watch them. Watch the good ones, watch the bad ones, watch the attitude of the airplane, and especially if it's the airplane you fly, if it's a 152, 172, PA-28, whatever it is, watch those other airplanes make their practice landings over and over. And then figure out what the good landings look like. Try and replicate that in your brain as you're making a landing. Get the outside picture of the airplane as much as you're interpreting what's happening from the inside. Obviously, crosswind correction is huge. Right rudder, left aileron, right rudder, depending on which way the wind is coming from. This is not a crosswind landing video, but understand that crosswind corrections are extremely important. If you are not aligned with the runway center line and your nose is not pointing in the right direction, you can get blown across the runway. I'm somebody who teaching once almost had a wing strike in a high wing airplane. I wasn't flying it. I was the instructor. And the crosswind corrections were fine. And then all of a sudden, just as we're about to touch down, all the corrections went away and the right wing dropped and we got pushed from left to right. And I said my airplane really, really fast. So crosswind correction, holding it all the way down, very important. And also ground proximity is part of that outside mental picture, right? You start to see it come up in your vision, in your peripherals. Proximity to the ground is part of your outside mental picture. Okay, so hopefully some of that will help you make, most importantly, safer landings, but also better landings. But like I said before, better and safer usually go hand in hand. And it's not just about making them most of the time. It's about making these better and safer all of the time. Practice will help get you there, I promise. Thanks for checking out this video. If you like this type of stuff, subscribe to my channel. I really would appreciate that. I've got lots more great content coming your way soon. Also, thumbs up on this video if it provided you some value. That would also greatly help me out. I'll see you next time.